Okay, so a short overview of international human rights law, particularly geared to Amnesty Groups. What are human rights? Let's start with that. So human rights aren't new, and they draw very much on the idea of natural rights. And this goes back to at least the ancient Greeks. So this is the idea that individuals, by virtue of being human, have certain entitlements, rights that dwell within their nature and aren't conferred by law. So they're not legal rights. Typically governments create laws and those confer rights, but natural rights dwell within individuals by virtue of the fact that they're human. So that's the basic idea, natural rights, and that concept has been adapted into the idea of human rights. And this idea is built on various influences. World religions have had a big impact on it. Most of them obviously have the idea of inherent human dignity, equality of souls before God, which is obviously can be seen to carry over into that concept of human rights. Medieval canon law, so church law, in the Catholic Church had a big impact because it was medieval canon law that started to put some detail and some flesh on some of the bones of this concept in areas like family rights, marriage rights, the treatment of foreigners or infidels as people in other faiths, as they were termed at the time. Other influences, the discovery of universal scientific laws from about 1500 or so has had an impact. So the idea that there are uniform common laws in nature followed into the idea that there could well be common consistent laws in terms of human conduct, human dignity, human nature. And the idea that there's a common core of human nature based on reason has also been very important, and that's particularly associated with the philosopher Kant in the 1700s. And you can see these ideas bubbling up through history at various points. People in the UK will often point back to Magna Carta of 1215, so this sort of treaty that was created between rebel barons and the king at the time, and which asserted various rights. So it established the notion of trial by jury of your peers. It embodied the rights of the church against the state at the time. Wasn't the only thing to do that, but that's in there. And things like the rights of towns as well. So you start to get some notions of collective rights included in Magna Carta as well. But you've got to roll forward quite a long way before you start to find rights in the terms that we would currently understand them. The US Declaration of Independence of 1775, so the American colonies breaking away from the British Empire, refers to unalienable rights which reside in individuals. And the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen at the start of the French Revolution talks about the imprescriptible rights of man, so the rights of man that don't need to be written down. And both of those instruments, the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, had a big influence on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which with which we're more familiar, of 1948. There are two big barriers to the notion of universal human rights, which are worth highlighting. One is the power of states. So the idea of national sovereignty in particular, and that idea is bound up with the notion that one state shouldn't interfere in the domestic affairs of another state. It's for a state to determine its own internal affairs. these concepts are very powerful and are very powerful still, articulated by all sorts of states in different circumstances, but perhaps particularly associated with states like Russia, China, currently. The other big barrier to the implementation of universal human rights is cultural relativism. So the idea that because culture varies from place to place, as of course it does, that therefore fundamental laws should vary from place to place. And you can see this in the variable treatment around the world of things like homosexuality, the treatment of women, and issues of personal liberty against collective liberty, for example. So, and basically the history of human rights and much of the academic study of human rights and the analysis of human rights is all about the tension between this idea of universal human rights based on natural rights and these two factors, the power of states or national sovereignty on the one hand and cultural relativism on the other hand. 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was definitely a turning point in the story of the development of human rights. The picture here shows Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was the widow of the US president who died in 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt chaired the commission which developed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And you can see her there holding a very large copy of it. And the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, followed the United Nations Charter of the 26th of June 1945. And that charter imposed an obligation on member states to promote human rights. So this was the first time that there had been an obligation on states to promote human rights. And obviously this was at the end of the Second World War. It was one of these sort of never again moments in history. It was possible, again, in that climate to sort of push through quite dramatic and radical changes, which represented a break with the past, which the UDHR did. The UDHR was proclaimed on the 10th of December 1948 by the United Nations General Assembly. And that's the reason that the 10th of December 1948 is Human Rights Day. And under the UDHR, states recognized the universal applicability of human rights. So this was a good moment for the notion of universal human rights. But the human rights in the UDHR were not binding. So they weren't legally binding on states, and it needed treaties to be entered into by states subsequently to turn these principles into binding legal obligations, and I'll explain how that happened. There are 30 articles in the UDHR, and they deal with civil and political and social and economic rights. So you can find stuff on housing and health and employment and education in there. So these things are not new. And Article 1, which I've reproduced here, really sums up the rest of the document. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And as a statement of human purpose, personally, I find that quite hard to beat. If you take it to pieces, it's really the French Revolution slogan, liberty, equality, and fraternity, with a few more words on it. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, liberty, equal in dignity and rights, equality, and they should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood, fraternity. I'm just going to check whether anybody else is trying to get in, because when I'm showing slides, I can't see the participant section, unless B, you're able to do that, are you? You able to let people in if there is anybody?
I'll attempt to.
Okay, well, if there is anybody, I'll leave that to you. Let me know if you have a problem.
Okay.
So there have been many subsequent international human rights instruments since the UDHR, and I'll talk about some of those subsequently. Let's have a look at different ways of looking at human rights. There are various ways of looking at human rights, and one approach is to break things down into the 3 generations of rights, and they're described as generations because they've had a sort of successive prominence over time. So the first generation of human rights under this approach is civil and political rights. So this includes things like the right to life, the right not to be tortured, the right to be treated with due process in terms of the legal system, the right to not to be arbitrarily arrested, right to property. All of those sorts of things would typically be described as civil and political rights, and these rights were Amnesty International's initial focus. I think that's fair to say. You've then got a second, what's called the second generation of rights, social and economic rights. And this would include things like the right to health, right to decent housing, right to education, right to employment. But it would also usually include things like the right not to be discriminated against, which obviously feeds into sort of general social justice. And Amnesty wasn't greatly involved in these rights until it took a decision to do so in about 2000 or so. So civil and political rights were essentially what Amnesty was about until 2000. And since then, it's expanded its remit to include the sorts of rights I've just described. And then the third generation of rights, which sort of comes along historically after the other 2, are what are called collective and solidarity rights. And these are typically the rights of groups. So most of what we've been talking about so far is all about the rights of individuals, but there are also rights of groups. And this would include, for example, the right to development. So the right of a group to, or a nation to pursue its economic and social development, the right to exploit a community's own resources, the right of a group to a decent environment, land rights. And it would also include something like self-determination, so the right of a people to determine its own political, social, cultural future. Now, these rights are quite prominent in some human rights instruments. They're prominent in the African Convention of Human Rights, for example. And I think it's fair to say that Amnesty International has sort of moved into these areas relatively recently. And to some extent in relation to some of them, so particularly say the right to a decent environment, is probably still exploring quite how to work effectively in those areas. So that's one way of looking at human rights in terms of generations. Another way of looking at human rights is in terms of negative and positive rights. And this isn't a value judgment, so this doesn't mean certain rights are good and other rights are bad, but it's all to do with how different rights operate. So negative rights are those rights that on the face of it are about the state leaving people alone. So freedom from torture, for example, freedom of expression, freedom of belief and religion. On one view, you could say, well, if the state would only leave people alone, they're not going to be tortured. They would have freedom of expression. They'd be free to pursue their own beliefs and religion. And these sorts of rights are the civil and political rights I've mentioned. So civil and political rights are often described as negative rights. Positive rights, on the other hand, entail, as it says here, obligations on the state to actually do something for citizens. So things like education, health services, housing, employment, on the whole, are not going to happen unless the state does something for its citizens. So these rights impose positive obligations on the state to act. And these rights tend to be the social and economic rights. And for that reason, social and economic rights are described as positive rights. However, it is arguable, and it's a view I hold, that all rights actually have positive and negative dimensions. So if you take perhaps the extreme example, torture, so the right not to be tortured, this actually has positive and negative dimensions. So it's easy to take the position that, well, if the state just leaves me alone, I'll be free from torture. But actually to eliminate torture and to make sure it doesn't happen in a state, in practice requires all sorts, it requires the state to do all sorts of things. It requires training, it requires culture to be developed. It might involve culture change. It involves, you know, security services to be recruited in a certain way, trained in a certain way, to operate in a certain way, to be disciplined in a certain way, and so on and so forth. And fairly quickly, you can see that the state is having to do quite a lot of stuff to make freedom from torture a reality. So freedom from torture does in fact involve a whole bunch of positive actions that the state has to take. The United Nations has this mantra at the bottom of the page, which crops up in all over its website and in all sorts of documents, that states have a duty to respect rights, protect them and fulfill them, to respect, protect and fulfill. And broadly, as you go right across the page through those three words, the state is having to take on more positive obligations to make things happen. So respect could be largely a matter of policy, for example. So arguably doesn't require a huge amount of resource, effort, time, infrastructure, and so on. Protecting rights clearly requires more action, and actually fulfilling them, making sure that people can enjoy them and enjoy them to the full, requires even more action. So the concept of negative and positive rights is helpful, I would argue, in terms of unpacking rights, but actually all rights have positive and negative dimensions. Another powerful idea about human rights is their interconnectedness. There was a United Nations World Conference on Human Rights in 1993, which came up with this formula that all human rights are universal, indivisible and interdependent and interrelated. And there's clearly an attempt to sort of establish human rights as a package that you can't unpack or chip away at. Everything depends on everything else. Everything is part of the whole. It's certainly the case that different categories of rights are mutually reinforcing. So civil and political rights, for example, without social and economic rights, can easily become nominal only. So this is the argument, you know, what good is freedom of expression if you don't know where your next meal is coming from, for example? And indeed, that's quite a good question, I think. If you turn that round, social and economic rights without civil and political rights can easily risk being not sustainable. So unless people are free and have liberty, social and economic conditions, favorable social and economic conditions, may well not be sustained, and certain human qualities, for example, are unlikely to flourish. So that's the basis for that particular argument. And if you take a couple of rights, so one a civil and political right, the right to vote, and the right to education, a social and economic right, you can unpack the interdependence between them and see that one depends on the other. So if you have voting without decent education, for example, the right to vote is going to be quite a hollow thing, I think. You know, people aren't going to be making informed decisions, they're not going to be up with the issues, they're not going to have the latest information, and so on and so forth. And similarly, education without voting, you can certainly deliver it up to a point in that way, but it is unlikely, I think, to be sustainably healthy, and is likely to be dominated by propaganda and indoctrination. So you can see how a particular civil and political right, the right to vote, and a particular social and economic right, the right to education, depend on one another and are mutually reinforcing. I just want to say a bit about the importance of social and economic rights, because Amnesty has come fairly late to the world of social and economic rights. I mentioned that it's been part of Amnesty's remit since 2000. Although, as I've also said, it was an integral part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is what Eleanor Roosevelt had to say about social and economic rights. And I'll let you read this rather than read it to you. So this is, for me, quite a powerful statement about the importance of conditions on our own doorstep as a dimension of universal human rights. And the idea, I think, that basic issues of human dignity, such as are being talked about here, you know, how you're treated in the workplace, at your school, and so on and so forth. The idea that these issues of human dignity are matters of justice, I think, is a very powerful one, and it's very powerfully articulated here. And you can see that sort of idea in all sorts of places. I don't know if any of you are fans of Ken Loach films, but a film like I, Daniel Blake, which is all about the iniquities of the benefit system, or Sorry We Missed You, his most recent one, which is all about the you know, the iniquities of the gig economy, are basically articulating this principle very very clearly, I think. We've got an example. The Banbury Group has a relationship with a nearby school and with a teacher there, and he's just I think retired, but for the last 2 or 3 years he was showing his sixth formers the film I, Daniel Blake, and then taking them to work in a food bank for half a day, and was presenting that to them as a human rights-based experience. And indeed, it was something that the school Amnesty Group was very heavily involved in. So that's the sort of venture that Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, would very much have approved of. This talk is focusing on international human rights law, but there are other areas of international law that affect human rights, and I thought it was worth just touching on these because you do come across them. International human rights law, obviously, that's the core of this talk. International humanitarian law is also relevant. So this is the law of armed conflict, which is all about trying to moderate the violence associated with warfare. So the Geneva Conventions are one of the core areas of international humanitarian law, and there are Geneva Conventions that deal with treatment of soldiers and sailors and prisoners of war and civilians. And there are other conventions that would come under the heading of international humanitarian law that deal with weapons control, for example. There's a 1925 protocol against the use of chemical weapons, which is still quite an important legal instrument. Another area that's relevant to human rights law is international criminal law. And since 2002, there's been an International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court deals with 4 areas of international crime: war crimes, genocide, the crime of aggression between states, and crimes against humanity. And I don't know if people have seen the news today, but Human Rights Watch have produced a report accusing Israel of the crime of apartheid, and in relation to the Palestinians. And apartheid is one of the crimes against humanity that is part of the remit of the International Criminal Court. Unfortunately, Israel is not a signatory to the statute of the International Criminal Court, so it won't be the International Criminal Court that does anything about it, but it's still a powerful statement and principle to be articulating, and it's possible that states will collaborate to do something about that or get behind it. We'll have to see. International criminal law draws on quite a long experience of the development of the concept of international criminal law at the Nuremberg trials after the end of the Second World War in Europe, the corresponding Tokyo trials, which dealt with the war in the Pacific, and there have been international criminal tribunals in relation to the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, the genocide in Rwanda. So the International Criminal Court and international criminal law is dealing with some of the sort of mass atrocity things that go on in the world. It's not been terribly productive since 2002, and the last time I looked, there had only been 28 cases in almost 20 years and only 8 convictions. But some of them are very high profile. So Radovan Karadzic, for example, the Bosnian Serb leader, was one of them. Mladic, the general for the Bosnian Serbs, was another one. But only 28 cases and 8 convictions in 20 years. But sometimes, you know, these things take a long time, and it can take generations for you know, important legal concepts to gain currency in some cases. The final area I just wanted to mention is international refugee law. And this is probably, I mean, all of these areas of law have weaknesses and problems, but this is probably the most problematic of all. International refugee law is based on the 1951 Refugee Convention, but almost all countries violate the basic principles of that convention. And even the concept of an asylum seeker is arguably a violation of that convention, because that convention sort of establishes the criteria under which people are either refugees or they aren't. And it's not necessary for a state to impose all sorts of conditions determining that. The convention is quite clear about what's a refugee and what isn't, but states don't go along with that. The other huge weakness in the international refugee in the Refugee Convention is that it provides only the most basic protections for internally displaced people, and an awful lot of the 80 million refugees in the world today are people who live in country A and are refugees in another part of country A, so they're internally displaced, so it's not very effective at dealing with that. Just before we have a break for some questions, I want to just talk about the international human rights law system. which operates at 3 levels. There's the United Nations system. There are regional systems, Europe and Africa and so on, and then there are also domestic laws that affect human rights. I just want to say a bit about each of these: the UN system, regional systems, and domestic laws. So the UN system, first of all. So we've mentioned the United Nations Charter of 1945. The United Nations has its own court, the International Court of Justice, which is an interstate forum. So it's a court in which one state takes legal action against another. And I was talking about the power of national sovereignty and non-interference in domestic affairs and so on. And that is quite a key driver of the fact that it's quite rare for one state to take action against another state, and largely because of the power of that principle. But there have been exceptions, and a famous one was Bosnia taking action against Serbia in the famous 2007 case to establish that what had gone on at Srebrenica in 1995 was indeed genocide. So that was a judgment of the International Court of Justice. We've mentioned the UDHR of 1948. The United Nations has a thing called the Human Rights Council. It's been called that since 2006. Before that, it was the UN Commission on Human Rights. And this is, if you like, a subset of the United Nations. It embraces 47 countries and is basically the United Nations sort of forum or tribunal dealing with international human rights matters. It's very political. A lot of its work is disrupted by, countries and their alliances pursuing their own interests and so on and so forth. There are also human rights treaties, and there are 9 main United Nations treaties on human rights. And those are, a really important one is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966, which came into force in 1976. And this is the convention which made legally binding the civil and political rights in the UDHR. I mentioned that when that came out in 1948, they weren't binding. And the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of 1966 made legally binding the economic, social, cultural rights in the UDHR. So although the UDHR is 1948, it wasn't until 1976 that both of these treaties came into force. And each of those treaties has its own court, if you like. The Human Rights Committee in the case of the ICCPR, and the Committee for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in the case of the ICESCR. So those are two absolutely core human rights treaties. And then there are 7 other main UN human rights treaties which deal with racial discrimination, discrimination against women, torture, children, so that's the Convention on the Rights of the Child, migrant workers, enforced disappearance, and disabilities. And just to take 3 country examples, the UK has ratified, i.e. brought into effect, 7 of these 9 treaties. The UK hasn't ratified the Migrant Workers Treaty or the Treaty about Enforced Disappearance. And when challenged, as it often is at the UN, why it hasn't ratified those 2, the argument is always that the government maintains that the protections that those treaties provide for exist in domestic law anyway. China, to take another example, has ratified 6 of these 9 treaties. It perhaps won't come as a surprise that it hasn't ratified the Civil and Political Rights Treaty, so it hasn't ratified one of the big ones. And it also hasn't ratified the Migrant Workers and the Disappeared Persons treaties. The US has only ratified 3 of these treaties, 3 of these 9 treaties. It has only ratified the Civil and Political Rights Treaty, the Treaty on Race, and the Treaty on Torture. And if you look at countries around the world, you get this very patchwork picture where some have ratified some of these treaties, others haven't. And countries also enter what are called reservations. So they say, well, we're going to follow this treaty broadly, but we're actually going to make exceptions for these provisions. So they cherry pick. So they go against that principle that, you can't cherry pick human rights that I mentioned. And there are also amendments to these treaties called protocols. And again, some countries adopt those and others don't. So it creates this real patchwork picture. And each of these treaties has its own enforcement mechanism as well. So, you've got separate treaty monitoring, you've got separate enforcement. So there is no world court of human rights. It's a very, very patchwork picture. Since 2006, there's been a thing called the Universal Periodic Review, the second, the penultimate bullet here. And this applies to all UN member states, of which there are 193. And it's a sort of departure from the idea of a sort of judicial body. It's a forum where peer review takes place. So once every 5 years, every UN member state is subject to a review by other countries of its human rights performance. And it's a cooperative mechanism. So countries make recommendations to other countries, and they share information and share best practices and this sort of thing. But the core of the process is countries making recommendations about individual countries that are subject to review. But it's entirely voluntary whether the country under review does anything about the recommendations. So you can imagine again how political this process gets. And countries are very good at just not budging on things that they regard as core to their national sovereignty, to their national interests. So a country like Russia, for example, this process doesn't get anywhere in terms of Russia seizing Crimea or its designs on Ukraine or those sorts of things. But having said that, countries like Russia and China also are prepared to make concessions on what they regard as sort of secondary matters. So while Russia is not in the least bit interested in making movements on political participation, freedom of expression, freedom of the media, all these sorts of things, it has made significant movement as a result of this process on things like treatment of mentally ill people in the health system and so on. So it's not a waste of time, the Universal Periodic Review, but it does produce benefits only in relation to certain sorts of issues. And Amnesty puts a huge amount of resource into this thing called the Universal Periodic Review and into its United Nations relations generally. And I don't know if any of you take the RSS feed of Amnesty's research department. But if you do, you'll see the extraordinary number of research reports on different countries, representations as part of the Universal Periodic Review that Amnesty generates. And basically Amnesty resources up in order to monitor and report on and make recommendations on every country's human rights situation. I had a look a month or two ago at Amnesty's representations for the countries whose 5-year review was happening in January this year. One of them was St. Lucia, population 150,000. And Amnesty made 37 detailed recommendations about the improvement of human rights in St. Lucia. And St. Lucia is obviously an important place along with every other country, but it's just to give you an idea of the seriousness and the resource that Amnesty puts into this system. And Amnesty really, in the way the UN system has developed, has become part of the international order in relation to human rights, and is very much one of the leading NGOs that liaise with the United Nations and are inputting into its processes. So those are some of the main things that go on in terms of the United Nations. There are, as the last bullet point says, there are other instruments that we haven't touched on. There's a genocide convention of 1948, which is very heavily criticized by lawyers and academics. The classic criticism of it is by the time you've established whether genocide has taken place, everybody's dead. And the Bosnia case I mentioned of 2007 is perhaps an example of that. So 7,000 mainly men and boys were killed in Srebrenica in 1995. In 2007, 12 years later, the International Court of Justice decided that was genocide. But nothing happened. It was purely a declaration. There were no sanctions, there was no reparations, no action was taken against anybody as a result of it. And there are also other instruments that deal with a whole range of other issues that we haven't got time to go into today, in terms of things like modern slavery, human trafficking, and so on and so forth. I'll just quickly talk about regional systems and then domestic laws, and then we'll have a break. So there are regional systems of human rights as well. There's a European system, and this is run by the Council of Europe. So this is nothing to do with the EU. So it's completely unaffected by Brexit. Britain is a member of the Council of Europe, and so are 47 other countries. So a quarter of the countries in the world are part of the Council of Europe. And the Council of Europe is behind the European Convention of Human Rights of 1950. And these 47 countries, by the way, cover 800 million people. And the European Convention on Human Rights is adjudicated through the European Court of Human Rights, which of course you know. And arguably the European Convention, the European Court of Human Rights is the most successful human rights system devised so far. The court is effective. There's quite a lot of evidence that the values of the European Convention have become pretty embedded in many of these 47 countries. You obviously get examples of regression. So, for example, populist governments in Hungary and Poland, for example, are departing from some of these principles in recent years. But taking the period from 1950 onwards as a whole, there's quite a strong case for arguing that this system has been quite successful. It's worth bearing in mind that it's only dealing with civil and political rights. So the European Convention does not cover economic, social, cultural rights in the main. And that's arguably quite a limitation to it. There's also a corresponding African system. So the African Union has created an African Charter of Human Rights, and there's an African Court of Human Rights as well. And as I've said, the African Charter is quite strong on collective rights, which is perhaps not a surprise in terms of, you know, what we know about culture and group identity and so on in African countries. So there's a lot of stuff about collective rights there, right to land and so on. And there's also a regional system in the Americas. So the Organization of American States has created an American Charter and an American Court of Human Rights, Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And it won't surprise you that the US hasn't ratified that convention. I'll just touch on domestic laws as well. I mean, this is not this is not the main focus of this talk, where I'm talking about international human rights, but domestic laws obviously have a huge impact on what human rights are like in particular countries. In the UK, we have the Human Rights Act of 1998, and this puts into domestic law the European Convention. So bear in mind, it's civil and political rights only. So it's not dealing with economic and social and cultural rights. So the Human Rights Act 1998 is not perfect. But obviously that's not an argument to throw it in the bin and necessarily try and invent something else. And it's had concrete achievements in terms of events in the UK. So the Hillsborough inquest, for example, depended on the Human Rights Act. Many issues of local authority care, separation of husbands and wives in care homes, these sorts of issues are often remedied as a result of the Human Rights Act. We've also got an Equalities Act of 2010, which is very important as well in establishing human rights of various groups. The Modern Slavery Act of 2015 is also very important. That's recently been beefed up in relation to some of the issues to do with the Uyghurs and supply chain and so on. And human rights protections are incorporated in many countries' constitutions. Not in the UK, but a country like South Africa, for example, has guarantees of human rights and social and economic rights in its constitution, which citizens can appeal to. And there, for example, it's led to victories in court about things like access to HIV, retroviral drugs, and other matters, which have led to very concrete improvements in the health situation there. So I will pause there and stop sharing. There's a bit more, but just to pause there, and if there are any questions, perhaps unmute yourself and ask me, or any thoughts or comments.
Thanks, Ian. It's been a really interesting talk. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Great. I was just wondering, actually, if there's more. I think it was a couple of slides back, a fifth pillar of other aspects of international law affecting human rights. Because my memory serves me right. Philippe Sands is also an expert on international environmental law.
Yeah.
And I think he wrote several books about it. But I often find it quite. It's certainly particularly important now in the context of the increasingly erratic climate. And I think when we hear Amnesty members saying, "Oh, we shouldn't start working on climate change or and such like, because Greenpeace and others have it covered." I think those of us who remember the Trafigura case, for example, in Ivory Coast, working with Greenpeace on that.
Yeah.
In reality, we've been doing it for decades, and I think it's as fundamental. It's not a criticism of you, obviously, Ian. But it just occurred to me it would be it's a really important addition. Given that you mentioned Philippe Sands at the beginning.
Yeah,
I guess.
Yeah, and there are other areas of law that affect human rights in terms of medical law and so on and so forth. So I'm not claiming these are the only areas of law that affect human rights, and all sorts of basic areas, contract and so on, that can sometimes have human
very true
implications as well. But yeah, I take your point about environmental law, and particularly in view of issues of the moment and so on. Yeah.
Well, it actually just occurs to me as well, even that you mentioned Magna Carta at the beginning. I heard recently that a load of COVID deniers were invoking Magna Carta as a means of dissenting from lockdown, and I think they later received legal advice reminding them that those areas only applied to barons, and so it illustrates how important it is to know your rights, and how worrying it is that we're all so subject to disinformation. I guess, and in some ways, actually, maybe you might come onto this, but I wonder if we need to perhaps sort of expand Article 19 to consider freedom from disinformation.
Yeah.
And it'd be interesting, I guess, to know where other areas that might be even missing from EDHR more generally.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
I don't know if you may be coming onto that, but
yeah. Well, I'm going to talk about is it possible for new rights to emerge, for example? So that would be an example. And of course, some of the critics of say the Human Rights Act argue that take that line that it's not covering the modern world adequately, and therefore needs reform and so on. I mean, that's the position that our MP here in Banbury takes, who's the Tory Minister Victoria Prentice. Her line is the Human Rights Act needs replacing with something more modern. But of course, you know
closer to Magna Carta, in there.
You know where she's coming from.
Yeah. Great.
Any other points or questions?
I just wanted to mention again something I mentioned to you after the last time I gave this talk, which was that I don't know whether anyone shares my view, but I myself had never heard of the Universal Periodic Review before you mentioned it, and I mean I haven't gone into much detail since then. Yeah. But as I understand, every state, you've said there that it applies to all members, but every state, as I understand, produces a pretty comprehensive report every 5 years.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And that report is subject to peer review, as you said, by other states, and they all join in. And then, of course, there's a lot of bland stuff that comes out.
Yeah.
But they're all pretty detailed. And they're all. There may be, for instance, when we're dealing with China and the Uyghur situation, there may well be things that we can pick up there that are very helpful in that.
Yeah. Well, it's also a really good way of finding out what particular states really think about human rights, because they tend to be quite upfront in their national reports about it. So China, for example, in the 2018 review, which is the most recent one it's been through, actually came clean on abandoning the notion of universal human rights and said that what it believed in wasn't that. It was human rights with Chinese characteristics. And they expand on what that means, and fundamentally, of course, it's the right to development, and the right to development means the right to state development, and it's there in black and white, and they presented it to the UN, but it's important for us as Amnesty people as well, I think, because Amnesty is very definitely on that bus with the Universal Periodic Review, and the International Secretariat and its research teams devote huge amounts of resources to making that system work. Sorry, Stefan, you had a point.
Sorry, I cancelled myself by mistake.
That's right.
Yeah, I was just wanted to note that we've been writing, as I'm sure you all have, a lot more letters to Egypt over the last decade or so, or half a decade or so, and we found great success by quoting the Arab Charter on human rights, rather than referencing the Universal Declaration. We've started using their own geographic charters, and I didn't realize there was an African one, for example. So there was, and we've actually had responses from Egypt because of us quoting their own regional charter.
Yeah.
So it's been quite a powerful tool for us as Amnesty members here to do that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting to hear, and it does strike me it's a sort of tack that Amnesty takes less and less these days, actually. The number of sort of template letters and so on that you see that start with, you're in violation of this treaty provision that you've actually signed up to, which actually used to be quite a common in Amnesty stuff. So that's perhaps something to think about. On Universal Periodic Review, as Martin said, most people have never heard of it. you know, arguably along with the European system, it's the bit of the human rights system that's working best, in my view. There've been 80,000 recommendations made by states about other states since it started in 2006, and 3/4 of them have been accepted by the state. Of course, you know, China's not accepting all the ones we could imagine they're not accepting, and Russia and likewise, and Egypt and so on, but on a whole range of issues that do actually affect the way people live their lives, vast numbers of recommendations are actually being acted on. And there is a Universal Periodic Review website. If you just put Universal Periodic Review in Google, I'm sure it'll be the first thing you find. And you know, there's a list of all 193 countries, and you can go into a particular review and you can see the documentation. And there are actually videos as well of the half-day meetings in which these recommendations are made and questions are put as well. And those are all available on that United Nations website. Okay, is there an we've got another Alex here who's got a question. Alex.
Hi there. Yes, thanks for the talk. This is Alex from Sheffield.
Hello, Alex.
Hi. I just got a question about the periodic review.
Yeah.
I understand that Amnesty puts a lot of resource into it. Do you feel it's a worthwhile way of spending that resource, especially given the kind of cynical approach in the council and also the sovereign states view, that sort of quite explicit kind of negative view of the whole process?
Well, I mean, my view is I take quite a positive view of the Universal Periodic Review process. I mean, it's got serious flaws, and it's not shifting big things, but it's generating lots of small benefits which add up to something. And there's so much of this international order that I'm describing that produces, you know, fairly scant results, that is quite reassuring when that happens. But I think there is a debate around how much resource Amnesty puts into it, and you know, this isn't for me to determine particularly, but it's just worth bearing in mind when Amnesty doesn't have the resource to do certain things or to pursue certain campaigns with more energy, that it is putting huge amounts of resource into Universal Periodic Review. So I personally am not clear myself on where the line should be drawn, but it's certainly something to be alive to, I think. Okay, shall we move on? Let me go back to the slides just for the last lap. Hold on. Okay, we're back with the slides. Hope you can all see this. So international human rights law, as we're hinting at, I think, is a highly contested area. And we haven't got time to go into all of these questions, but it's just to give you an idea of some of the sorts of debates that go on in international human rights law. So are human rights really universal? Are they culturally specific? So this is where cultural relativism comes up against universal human rights. There are people who think human rights, international human rights law is very much a sort of Western project. But you know, countries all over the world sign up to these treaties. Every UN member state participates in the Universal Periodic Review, which has the UDHR as its main standard. On the other hand, you've got China, as I've said, saying it's all about human rights with Chinese characteristics. You could actually make quite a good case, I think, that the UK pursues human rights with British characteristics as well. It never uses those words, but does put its own spin and emphasis on human rights. Protections for most economic, social, cultural rights are quite weak in the UK. And that's partly because of attachment to sort of market economy principles. But you know, there's a lot of contextualization of human rights that goes on, And the European Convention actually facilitates a lot of that. Most of the rights in the European Convention are qualified, they're not absolute. And there are provisions saying, you know, states can shape these according to conditions in their state and the particular moral environment and all the rest of it. And it affects right to freedom of religion and belief particularly. So there's a debate there. Are some human rights more important than others? There are some human rights fundamentalists who will say, well, it's all part of a whole, you know, you can't say any part is more important than another. I personally don't hold to that. I think the right to life is more important than the right to paid holiday, for example. I'm not saying the right to paid holiday isn't important, but it just seems to me the right to life is more important. Should social and economic rights be matters for the courts, or are they properly areas for executive power of government? That's the position of the UK government, for example. But there are plenty of places around the world where you can take the government to court if your housing conditions are terrible, or the education you're receiving is terrible, and so on and so forth. Can new human rights emerge over time? So this is Alexi's point. Well, yes, they can. The right to a decent environment has been sort of created out of piecing a whole bunch of other rights together. And new situations clearly arise that end up falling within protections of these treaties and instruments. So things like, you know, data protection on the internet, and transgender rights, and so on and so forth. So new rights can definitely emerge over time. How to balance competing human rights. The right of expression often comes up against other rights, you know, rights of people to practice their religion, and so on and so forth. And this comes back to the question of whether human rights can be qualified. And as I've said, in many cases they are. Is it ever appropriate to suspend certain human rights? Well, many of these human rights treaties I've described do provide for some, at least, of their provisions to be suspended in cases of national emergency, for example. And it's obviously down to the state to ultimately to define what a national emergency is. But equally, most of these treaties contain sort of core provisions where it says you can't suspend them in those circumstances. A really significant weakness of the international human rights law system generally is how it deals with non-state actors. So pretty much everything we've been talking about is about the relationship between the state on the one hand and individuals or groups on the other. And as we know, you know, militias, IS, corporations can have a profound effect on people's human rights, and in some parts of the world are more significant than states. So that is a major challenge to the international human rights order. Does an emphasis on rights downplay the importance of duties and responsibilities? I mean, this is an interesting one, and one on which I've got plenty of views. Would support for human rights be greater if that was addressed, if there was more of an emphasis on duties and responsibilities? Article 1 of the UDHR is obviously saying that, you know, people have responsibilities towards one another. They need to act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. I mean, a lot of human rights issues would go away if that was the case. And arguably, you know, that those principles could have more prominence in international human rights law. I mean, Gandhi, for example, was certainly of the view that you know, there was a balance between these two things, and it had got out of kilter. And you know, one of the weaknesses of human rights culturally is that it tends to be something that people on the political left support and people on the political right don't. And you know, I went with Martin, who's here this evening, to a reception that John Bercow put on in the Houses of Parliament a few years ago on Human Rights Day, and he invited all the MPs along. And there were, I think, 2 or 3 Tory MPs there at most. You know, there were tens of Labour MPs, and all the Lib Dems were there. And, you know, in terms of getting general cultural acceptance and support for human rights, the fact that people on the right tend to be more skeptical of human rights is a problem. It's interesting what issues can unite people across the left and the right. And, you know, the plight of the Uyghurs, for example, has very noticeably been supported by Tory MPs. You know, it's Ian Duncan Smith and others who have been sanctioned by China for speaking out about the Uyghurs. And of course, it's because, you know, they're latching on to the civil and political rights aspects, the, you know, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, you know, all these basic civil and political rights. So, you know, there's no easy answer to it, but it's just something to think about in terms of building a broad base of support for human rights. And it's certainly something relevant to Amnesty Groups operating on the ground in places like Banbury, where, you know, there aren't that many left-wing supporters, if I can put it that way. Can universal human rights ever be realized in a world of nation states? I mean, that's along with cultural relativism, as I've said, is one of the major tensions involving trying to get universal human rights implemented around the world, and how to get states to play ball and how to keep them on board with these systems as well. And I would argue the most successful mechanisms for doing that have been the ones that have compromised the European system, universal periodic review. Does anybody want to come in on any of that? No? Okay, well, sorry.
I could, Ian. Sorry, no. Just
sorry, Alexei. Go ahead, Alexei. Go on. And then Stefan.
I was just remembering this campaign. I think it was called Article 31. That was about access to water. Yeah. Which, of course, I forget which article it is that covers food and healthcare, which you would assume sort of covers water, but specifically drinkable water was I think a really important point, and that actually a lot of the bottled water companies were actively lobbying against such proposals. But just as an extension of the point I was thinking about earlier, other aspects of laws that certainly in the UK's case, in the Equalities Act, there's very little mention or discussion about social class as a dimension in relation to discrimination. But I think there are definitely movements to expand those ideas. It's just often it's very difficult when you're thinking about how you define these things. Yeah, it can be very subjective.
Yeah,
but just wondering what else others thought about things like that.
Stefan, you had a comment, I think.
It was more of a question, really. And so, am I right in thinking that the idea of a qualified human right and a limited human right and an absolute human right is already in place in the Universal Declaration? That a lot of the case law where rights have to be balanced off against each other seems to rely on that system as it stands. I wondered if you had anything to say on that.
What the extent to which rights are qualified in law? Is that
yes?
Well, they are quite heavily. So in the the Civil and Political Rights Convention, and most of those UN treaties, there are overrides, for example, that states can apply. There are so-called non-derogable rights that can't be tampered with, like the right to life, the right to torture, for example. Those would be in that category. But many other rights, freedom of expression, assembly, association, those sorts of things, are often qualified. So there aren't that many absolute rights knocking around. Yeah. Okay, should we carry on? Right, I'm not going to go through this slide, but it's really just to give you a flavour of different things that drive improvements of human rights on the ground. So it can be quite easy to become blinkered in terms of what makes for changes in human rights. And I think there's a pretty good case that all these things can have an impact, and you'll be able to think of other things as well. Economic development, I mean, if you believe in social and economic rights, then economic development is clearly something that can alleviate or improve social and economic rights. And while a country like China clearly denies a whole range of fundamental freedoms, it has a really historic achievement to its name, which is taking, according to the World Bank, 850 million people out of poverty since 1998. So, that sort of thing is just worth bearing in mind in weighing up the balance in relation to China, say. And I've listed a whole bunch of other factors here: political action, cultural movements, the quality of governance, initiatives to improve state governance, corporate governance. Non-state actors are more and more important, development of welfare programs, and so on. And of course, human rights activism is there, decisions by judges, international sanctions, independent journalism. There's a whole range of factors. And for us as activists, it's worth thinking, in whatever context we're in, about the levers we can pull in these different arenas, I think, in order to achieve improvements in human rights. I'm going to skip that one and move on to implications for Amnesty. So Amnesty is very much rooted in international human rights law. And you can see I've quoted the Amnesty's vision as the first bullet here from the Amnesty Statute. Our vision is a world in which every person enjoys all the human rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights standards. But Amnesty hasn't always believed that. It started out focusing very much on prisoners of conscience when it started in 1961. In the early 70s, it started to campaign on torture, and then later in the 70s started to campaign on the death penalty. And it's only really since 2000 that it's embraced the whole human rights agenda. And its evolution, and I think it's important to appreciate that, Amnesty is not in a test tube, it's in the world, and its evolution has taken place, reflecting changes in broader society. And Amnesty's evolution does mirror those generations of human rights that I described earlier. So it's started off focusing very much on civil and political. It's moved into economic, social and cultural, and it's sort of coming to terms with how to advocate for and champion and campaign for some of the collective and group rights. Human rights law informs Amnesty's campaigns on torture, the death penalty, on refugees. We've mentioned how Amnesty can refer to a particular human rights law provision in communicating with a given state, for example. Human rights laws also affected the way Amnesty is organized. So there's a treaty on discrimination against women. Amnesty has a women's network. There's a treaty on the rights of the child. Amnesty has a children's network, and so on. But sometimes Amnesty goes well beyond the treaties and the standards, and it did so in working for the Arms Trade Treaty in 2013, which is one of Amnesty's most significant organizational achievements. But thinking about Amnesty and human rights law does, I think, make us think about the key challenge that Amnesty faces, which is how to deliver effectiveness and impact with such a wide mission and with limited resources. And so questions of focus are very much to the fore, I think, when when you're thinking about how Amnesty can be effective. So where should Amnesty focus in terms of particular rights? For example, we've got all these different categories of rights. It's not possible to cover everything within all of them. So where should the focus be? Where should Amnesty's focus be in terms of the gravity of human rights violations? I have to say, I'm jolly glad I don't have to decide how much resource to devote to, say, the Uyghur issue, as opposed to an individual case like Nazanin, for example. These are impossible decisions to make, and I have huge sympathy for those who have to make operational decisions to put so much resource into one and so much resource into the other. Where to focus in terms of countries as well, and how to put how much resource and time and energy is put into domestic human rights violations as opposed to an international focus. We've then got the issue of how much energy to devote to seeking states' compliance with international law. I've described how Amnesty internationally puts a huge amount into UN relations, research, reporting as part of universal periodic review, and engaging with the international system generally, and has become very much part of that international order, performing a really key function as part of civil society and as an NGO in the development of a human rights international culture. Amnesty plays a really important part in that, but that is a very different activity from direct action in terms of people power and protest and so on and so forth. And in a time when various governments appear just to ignore the law, although perhaps with Joe in the White House the pendulum is tipping back the other way a bit, we'll have to see. You can see how the argument for more direct action and less painstaking work as part of the international order, you can see how those sort of arguments come to be made. And then which activities to prioritize. Amnesty is involved in all of these things here: education, research, campaigning, government relations, partnering. My own view is Amnesty doesn't spend enough time on education. You look at all of these international treaties, and they all in their preambles stress how important it is that there is support at a social level and understanding of human rights. And indeed, there's a lot of stuff around the creation of the UDHR that basically, unless there was widespread education and people, becoming familiar with human rights concepts and making them part of their daily life, then the situation wouldn't be sustainable. I think that carries quite a lot of weight. But again, there are decisions around those parameters, and then how to engage people, ensure diversity of the movement and so on and so forth in terms of the issues that are selected, the campaigns, the methods, and the targeting, and so on. And this talk is not going to resolve these issues, but I hope the discussion of the legal concepts and the legal system helps to address some of these arguments and some of these points as we work out how best to move human rights forward. So finally, I don't lose sight of the wood for the trees message. There's an awful lot of complexity here, and I'm conscious I've conveyed an awful lot of information, but don't lose sight of the woods for the trees. And I thought I would just close by sharing with you a statement that I came across in one of the many articles I read as part of this course, which just sort of shone out as a simple statement of what human rights are all about, and why, certainly why I'm in it. So certain things ought not to be done to any human being, and there are certain other things that ought to be done for every other human being. So I'll end on that quote. Thanks very much. So any final thoughts or questions?
I think it seems like Amnesty to me, there's so much for it to cover, isn't there? And that it's possibly stretched really, really thinly. So this, one of the points that you flagged up there about the importance of partnering, there are lots of other organisations out there now, and I don't know whether Amnesty sees it itself in competition with any of these other human rights organisations, or whether if they collaborated together, they could help to be more effective in that some, specialise in certain areas, or, they benefit from specialisms and they're not spread so thin.
Yeah,
I know.
I mean, Amnesty does work with like-minded organisations in various ways. Particularly in relation to things like court cases and taking the UK government to court about breaking its own rules around arms exports to the Yemen and so on. That was a coalition of groups, and on many campaigns and initiatives, you can see Amnesty working with other groups. I mean, one of the things we try, as you know, Jane, one of the things we tried to do in this festival is to, open the door to partnerships with other organisations at a local level, and that's part of why we, went with the sort of Festival of Social Justice rather than Festival of Human Rights, because we felt social justice created a sort of common area that we share with other organisations, and I think sometimes with Amnesty there can be it doesn't necessarily come naturally to partner with other organisations, and part of that is because Amnesty is so clear on its human rights focus, and is grappling with the intersection with environmental law that Alexei referred to, for example, and other areas as well. But ultimately, the only way you can achieve anything if you have limited resources and a very big mission is to work with other organisations, and organisations in all sorts of spheres, and some of them I've worked for have had to grapple with that notion. So I'm sure that partnerships is going to be a bigger feature of Amnesty in the future than it has been in the past. I'm sure that's going to be the case. Anything else?
Hi, Ian. I just got a question. This is probably going to be quite personal to your experience. In what ways would you say that completing a master's aided you in your activism for Amnesty?
Well, it's helped me to think about, you know, fundamental questions of purpose and you know, what motivates me in relation to human rights. So all of those sorts of things. I mean, the issues, you know, and everybody's different, and you know, I'm sure people here are motivated by different things, but I'm particularly motivated by the plight of peoples and oppressed groups. So you know, the sorts of issues that get me most worked up are things like what's happening to the Uyghurs, what's happening to the Rohingya, what's happening to Palestinians. The other day I was involved in a call about the pastoralist communities in Angola that Amnesty is working for, which David here knows well. And you know, this was a Zoom call involving 6 or 7 local groups in the UK, an activist in Angola, some Amnesty activists in Johannesburg, a researcher in London, a couple of country coordinators, all basically sharing information about the situation of these communities in Angola who are facing starvation because their land's been taken away. And then discussing what we were going to do about it, who we were going to make representations to, and so on. It just struck me that sort of collective endeavour, international, was very much Amnesty at its best, and was, you know, only Amnesty could do that. And that just struck me as, you know, a really good experience that I hope will obviously lead to, you know, constructive action that makes a difference. But doing the course has helped me just to think more clearly about, you know, what motivates me and the value I attach to that sort of situation. I think it undoubtedly connects you as well with a whole range of issues out there that you might otherwise be oblivious to. So, you know, something like the Universal Periodic Review, for example, which I actually did the thesis on in the course. I mean, I'd be in the boat most people are in of hardly even knowing it exists if I hadn't done the course, I'm sure. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. But is that helpful, Alex?
This is very helpful indeed, thank you.
Yeah.
I suppose it wouldn't be suitable for all the audience on here, but I would be interested in knowing any books that you may have read that you found instructive,
Okay.
linking the human rights theory to activism is something that I maintain an interest in. Like I do have a copy of the book that you mentioned early on. About that city in Ukraine, which is, I agree, is truly excellent as an understanding the development of 20th century human rights, and also the crazy coincidence that these people lived in the same quite small town at different times, I believe, but they were both there. And also, I've read a World Made New, like the biography essentially of the UDHR. If you're really interested in how it got drafted, that's really good. But if there's anything else you can recommend, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. Well, perhaps I'll circulate the slides to everybody here, and I'll add to it some thoughts on, you know, further reading, to coin a phrase. Is that all right?
That'd be great, thank you.
Yeah, okay, great. Sorry, so, is somebody else? Yeah, David.
Oh, well, yeah, it's probably not a very constructive comment, but for some weeks, I suppose, if not more, I've been grappling with the thought. I did, probably after your last talk that I was involved or listened to, I had a look at the Universal Periodic Review for Angola, for example, because that's what I was interested in at the time. And it was really very good stuff. You know, the government was respecting human rights and all the rest of it. But then I looked at the situation on the ground of the farmers that we were talking about the other day, and nobody's gone along to help them. They just had a land grab that makes the Enclosure Acts in this country look like, you know, going to church.
Yeah.
There are people starving because of the act of that government. Yet Universal Periodic Review doesn't actually go to that kind of thing. And as I say, it's not a very constructive comment, but I've been grappling with it, if you like.
Yeah. Oh, it's the Universal Periodic Review is flawed. There's no doubt about that. And clearly, you know, what's going on there in Angola is to a large extent fueled by corruption, isn't it? And you know, corrupt politicians and so on and so forth.
I think that's true throughout Africa. There was an Economist article about it just before Christmas.
Yeah.
And it is regarded throughout Africa as the way to sort of pay your pension.
And there are any number of initiatives going on to try and improve standards of governance in Africa, and you know, the African Union has its own peer review process looking at governance in countries, and you know, in which other countries in Africa get involved, and so on and so forth. I mean, countries generally seem much more receptive to criticism coming from their neighbours and countries like them. And you do see this development happening within states generally, is creation of blocks and communities of interest amongst countries, whether they're Pacific Island countries or developing countries or whatever. And again, that's, you know, it's sort of identifying levers that can be constructive and can lead to positive change. That you know, that there's something, you know, to go with the grain of there, perhaps. Yeah, Alexis, hi.
Thanks, Ian. That was really fascinating stuff. Since you mentioned the slides, I recall you skipped over one. I was just wondering what it was, if that's okay.
Well, it was just one that was going to tie us up for a bit of time, I felt.
Oh, okay, fine.
You know, you sometimes have to make judgments, don't you, about what to cover, not to cover. But it was it's a slide of pros and cons of the system, basically. Things that are arguably achievements and big things that the system hasn't cracked. I mean, I can go back to it if you like. I mean, if
only if we have time. I don't know how much time people have, but I was just intrigued.
Yeah, well, let me just quickly find it. Hold on. Hold on. Yeah, it was this one.
Okay. Oh, if it's all there, then that's great.
So you'll see that when I send them round. I mean,
thanks very much.
This could easily tie us up for another half an hour. So fascinating though this is, I don't think
indeed,
people are up for that.
I asked too many questions.
No. No, it's all right. So is there anything else anybody wants to say before we wrap up? No? Okay. Well, I hope it's been helpful, both for understanding and for, you know, helping you to think about action as well. I mean, that's, I hope I'm an impact-driven person, and I'm only really interested in this stuff because by thinking clearly about things, you can frame what needs to be done about things. I mean, that's how I see it. I'll circulate the slides. If anybody's got any queries subsequently, do feel free to get in touch. And of course, do check out the Festival of Social Justice events on the Festival of Social Justice website. We've got a YouTube channel as well, which you can get to from the website. But if you just search for Festival of Social Justice YouTube, you'll get there as well. And also check out. There's an Amnesty Academy, a bit like Universal Periodic Review. Most people probably aren't aware of this, which goes back to what I was saying about Amnesty perhaps needing to put a bit more energy and juice into education. But if you just search on Amnesty Academy in Google, you will go to some very good pages on the Amnesty UK website, where there are some short free courses on various aspects of human rights. And there are also links to a couple of the MOOC platforms, Future Learn and edX, where there are more substantial bits of learning that can be done in this area as well. So there's actually a lot of free structured learning that is available. It's also very practical and geared to you know, the activist community. So that's the Amnesty Academy. So thanks again. Thanks very much for your time. Thanks for your questions, your participation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks
Thank you
a lot.
very much, Ian.
Thanks,
That's
Ian.
great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.